If you are listening from anywhere in the world, let me tell you something that might save your life someday. Never trust someone who says they know these mountains better than you do when you've been walking them for 78 years. And never, ever turn your back on family when there's money involved. My name is Maria Santos, and I'm sitting here in my little cabin on Whispering Ridge, looking out at the same Appalachian peaks that nearly killed me 3 years ago. Not because of a rock slide or a sudden storm, though God knows I've survived plenty of those. No, these mountains nearly claimed me because my own nephew, Eddie, and his wife Sarah thought it would be easier to inherit my land if I just disappeared. They had no idea what kind of strength they had awakened. This is a true story about betrayal, survival, and what happens when someone tries to break a woman who was forged by these ancient hills. It's about the moment when everything you thought you knew about family crumbles like loose shale under your boots, and how sometimes the thing that's meant to destroy you becomes the very thing that teaches you who you're meant to be. I never planned to become a legend in these parts. Hell, I never planned to live to see 78, especially not after what Eddie and Sarah put me through. But here I am, and I've got something to tell you about what it means to fall, and what it takes to climb back up. 3 days and nights I spent on that cliff face, with nothing but the clothes on my back and 70 years of mountain wisdom keeping me alive. 3 days of Eddie and Sarah thinking they'd finally gotten rid of the stubborn old woman standing between them and $1 million inheritance. They thought they were smart, you see. They thought they understood these mountains. They were wrong on both counts. But this story isn't just about them, and it's not just about me. It's about what happens when you realize that the very thing someone tried to use to destroy you, these wild, unforgiving peaks, becomes your salvation. It's about how sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what you're really worth. Little did I know that being pushed into that ravine would be the beginning of the worst and best chapter of my life. My story begins where all mountain stories do, with the land itself, and the people who first taught me to listen to it. I was born Maria Elena Rodriguez in 1946, right here in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, in a cabin not 5 miles from where I sit today. My parents, Jose and Elena Rodriguez, had come north from Mexico in the 1940s, following work in the timber industry. They were among the few Latino families in these hills back then, but the mountains don't care about the color of your skin or the language you speak at home. They only care if you're smart enough to respect them. My father was the one who first put hiking boots on my feet. Jose Rodriguez stood barely 5'6", but he could read these mountains like a book written in stone and sky. He worked as a logger during the week, but on weekends, he was our family's guide to every peak, valley, and hidden creek within 50 miles. Mija, he would say to me in his careful English mixed with Spanish. These mountains, they are not just rock and trees. They are alive. They speak to you if you know how to listen. I was 5 years old the first time he took me up Bald Eagle Peak. I remember my little legs burning, my lungs working hard in the thin air, and the way my father would stop every few hundred yards to point out a track in the mud, a change in the wind, the way certain trees lean when there's going to be bad weather. See that, Maria? The way the moss grows thicker on the north side of this oak? That tells you direction even when the sun is hiding. And here, he knelt down, pointing to scratches on a tree trunk. Bear sign. Fresh. Maybe 2 days old. We go quiet now. My mother, Elena, was the practical one. She taught me which plants would heal a cut, which berries were safe to eat, and how to preserve meat when you're miles from civilization. She could make a meal out of what most people would call weeds, and she could predict weather changes better than any television forecast. But it was the combination of both parents that made me who I became. From my father, I learned to read the mountain's moods, to understand its dangerous beauty. From my mother, I learned to survive whatever those moods might bring. I was 12 when tragedy first taught me that the mountains give and take in equal measure. It was March of 1958, and we were having one of those late winter storms that can turn deadly fast in these hills. My father had gone out to check on some logging equipment that had been left up near Cedar Falls, valuable machinery that the company couldn't afford to lose to the weather. He never came home. They found him 3 days later, pinned under a tree that had come down in the wind. The official report said it was an accident, just one of those things that happens when you work in the woods. But I knew better. Even then, my father was too careful, too respectful of the mountain's power, to get caught like that. It was my mother who figured out the truth, and it was a lesson that would save my life decades later. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the mountains isn't the weather or the wildlife. It's the people who think they can take shortcuts. The tree that killed my father had been cut wrong by careless loggers. They'd left it hanging, what we call a widowmaker, because they were in a hurry to finish their quota and get paid. When the storm winds came, that tree finally let go. And my father was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But here's what I learned from my mother in the weeks that followed. Grief can either break you or forge you into something stronger. Elena Rodriguez chose strength. She took over my father's role as our local guide, becoming one of the first women in these parts to lead hunting and hiking expeditions professionally. "The mountains took your papa," she told me one morning as we prepared for a guided hike with some tourists from the city. "But they also gave him to us for 20 years. They gave us knowledge, and now we share that knowledge. That's how we honor him." I was 15 when I first led a group on my own, 3 businessmen from Charlotte who wanted to climb Little Pinnacle for the weekend. My mother watched from a distance as I guided them up trails I could walk blindfolded, teaching them the same lessons my father had taught me. When we came back down 2 days later, all 3 men alive and grateful, and talking about the best weekend they'd ever had, my mother just nodded. "You have the gift, Mija. The mountains speak to you." She was right. I could sense weather changes hours before they hit. I could find water in places that looked bone dry. I could read animal sign like a newspaper and navigate by stars, by moss, by the way shadows fell across certain rocks. But more than that, I could read people. I could tell within the first hour of a hike who would panic in a crisis, who would push themselves too hard, who might make dangerous decisions when they got tired or scared. This skill would keep dozens of hikers safe over the decades. And it would save my own life when my nephew showed his true colors. By the time I was 18, I was running Santos Mountain Guide Service with my mother. By 25, after Elena passed peacefully in her sleep, I was the most sought-after guide in 3 counties. That's when I met James Santos, a forest ranger from Virginia, who'd come to help with a search and rescue operation. We worked together for 5 days looking for a lost hiker, and by the time we found the man safe and sound, I knew I'd found my life partner. James understood these mountains the way I did. More importantly, he understood that my work as a guide wasn't just a job, it was a calling. He proposed to me on the summit of Whispering Ridge, the same peak where I sit today, and we built our life together around our shared love of these ancient hills. We had 35 good years together before cancer took James in 2010. No children of our own, but we'd guided and mentored hundreds of young people over the decades, teaching them wilderness skills and mountain safety. Our legacy lived in every person who learned to respect these peaks instead of trying to conquer them. After James died, I kept working. What else was I going to do? These mountains were my life, and helping people navigate them safely was the only purpose I'd ever known. I should have paid more attention to my nephew Eddie during those years after James passed. I should have noticed how often he started asking about my property, about my will, about whether I was thinking of retiring. I should have remembered what my mother taught me about the most dangerous creatures in the mountains being the ones that look harmless. But I was 75 years old, grieving my husband, and still believing that family meant something. I trusted Eddie because he was blood, because he was my late brother's son, because he'd been coming to Sunday dinners at my place for 40 years. That trust nearly got me killed. But it also taught me something powerful. The mountains had made me stronger than I ever knew, and no human being, not even family, was going to break what 7 decades of wilderness survival had built. Little did I know that Eddie's betrayal would become the catalyst for the most important work of my life. Eddie Rodriguez, he kept our family name even after his father, my brother Miguel, passed, had always been the charming one. While his cousins were off getting into trouble, or struggling to find their way in life, Eddie seemed to have it all figured out. He married Sarah, a pretty real estate agent from the valley, bought a nice house in town, and worked his way up to regional manager at the local credit union. On the surface, everything looked perfect. That should have been my first warning sign. In 75 years of living in these mountains, I'd learned that when something looks too perfect, there's usually something rotten underneath. Eddie started coming around more often after James died. At first, I was grateful for the company. Sunday dinners, holiday visits, the occasional call to check on Tia Maria. It felt like family, like the kind of care I'd always hoped for as I got older. You know, Tia, you're getting up there in years, Eddie would say, always with that concerned smile that made him look so much like his father. Sarah and I worry about you up here all alone. What if something happened? What if you fell or had a heart attack? I'd laugh him off. Eddie Mijo, I've been taking care of myself in these mountains since before you were born. I'm not some fragile old lady you need to worry about. But he kept pushing, gentle-like, the way water wears down stone. Sarah would join in too, always with that sweet voice and those perfectly manicured nails that had never seen a day of real work. Maria, we just love you so much, she'd say, touching my arm with those soft hands. We want to make sure you're taken care of. Have you thought about updating your will? Making sure everything's in order. The questions started innocently enough. Had I considered selling the property? Wouldn't I be more comfortable in one of those nice senior communities down in the valley? Wouldn't it be smart to have someone younger handling my finances? What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until much later, was that Eddie had been doing research. He'd found out about the mineral rights that came with my 120 acres on Whispering Ridge. Apparently, there was talk of natural gas deposits in the area, the kind of thing that could make a property worth 10 times what it appeared on paper. Sarah, with her real estate connections, had probably figured out the potential value before Eddie did. Together, they'd done the math and realized that patient old Tia Maria was sitting on what could be over $1 million in land and mineral rights. The problem was, I wasn't dying fast enough for their liking. The pressure started getting more direct about 2 years after James passed. Eddie began bringing official-looking papers to Sunday dinner, suggesting I sign a power of attorney, just in case. Sarah started dropping hints about how expensive medical care was getting, how important it was to streamline my assets. You know, Maria, Sarah said one afternoon as we sat on my porch looking out over the valley, Eddie and I have been talking. If something happened to you, God forbid, it would be such a mess to sort through everything. Wouldn't it be easier if we were already set up as your beneficiaries? Just for the practical stuff, you understand. I was starting to understand, all right. But I wasn't ready to believe it yet. The turning point came in the spring of 2021. Eddie had been pressing me hard about signing over power of attorney, claiming it was just a safety measure, in case I ever needed help managing my affairs. When I kept refusing, his charm started slipping. Damn it, Tia, you're being stubborn, he snapped during one Sunday dinner, his mask falling for just a moment. You can't live up here forever. You're almost 80 years old. Sarah shot him a look that could have frozen hell, and his smile snapped back into place like a rubber band. I'm sorry, Maria. I just worry, you know. We both do. We love you so much. But I'd seen the flash of anger, the glimpse of what was really underneath all that concern. That night, after they left, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and really thought about what I was seeing. Eddie had never been interested in the mountains. Even as a kid, when Miguel would bring him up to visit, Eddie complained about the hiking, the bugs, the lack of cell phone service. He was a town boy through and through, more comfortable with air conditioning and paved roads than wilderness trails. Sarah was even worse. She tolerated our family gatherings, but I'd noticed how she never ate much of my cooking, how she was always checking her phone, how she looked at my cabin like it was something primitive and embarrassing. So why were they suddenly so concerned about my welfare? Why the sudden interest in my safety and my will? The answer came to me the way mountain weather does, gradually, then all at once. They wanted me gone and they wanted my land. But I still wasn't ready to believe family could be that cold, that calculating. I still thought maybe I was just being paranoid, that grief over James was making me suspicious of innocent concern. That summer, Eddie and Sarah started suggesting hiking trips. You know, Tia, we should spend more time up on the trails with you. Learn some of that mountain wisdom you're always talking about. I should have known better. Eddie had never wanted to learn mountain wisdom in 40 years of family gatherings. But I was lonely, and part of me wanted to believe that maybe, at this late stage of life, I could finally share my love of these peaks with family. The first few hikes went fine. Eddie complained about the difficulty, Sarah worried about bugs and poison ivy, but they seemed genuinely interested in learning. They asked questions about navigation, about identifying edible plants, about reading weather signs. I thought I was teaching them survival skills. I had no idea I was teaching them how to kill me. It was August when Sarah first mentioned the trail to Devil's Backbone Ridge. Maria, Eddie and I were looking at some old maps, and we saw this trail that goes way up to this ridge we'd never heard of. It looks so remote and beautiful. Could you show us sometime? Devil's Backbone Ridge was remote, all right. It was also one of the most dangerous trails in the area. A narrow spine of rock with 1,000-foot drops on either side, and weather that could turn deadly without warning. I'd guided maybe a dozen groups up there in 50 years of professional work, and only the most experienced hikers. That's not a trail for beginners, I told them. Maybe we should work up to something like that. Try some of the easier peaks first. But they kept bringing it up, kept pushing. We trust you completely, Maria. You're the best guide in the mountains. We know you'd keep us safe. The flattery should have been another warning sign. Eddie and Sarah had never shown much respect for my expertise before. But I was 78 years old and proud of my reputation. When someone tells you they trust your skills completely, it's hard not to want to prove them right. That's how they convinced me to take them up to the place where they planned to kill me. We set out on a Tuesday morning in late August, just the three of us. Eddie was carrying a heavy pack, which I thought was smart. Better to have too much gear than not enough on a challenging trail like Devil's Backbone. What I didn't know was that the pack was full of evidence they planned to leave behind after I accidentally fell off the ridge. The hike up took most of the morning. Eddie and Sarah were slower than usual, stopping frequently, asking lots of questions about the terrain. At the time, I thought they were just being careful, maybe finally taking the mountain seriously. Looking back, I realized they were mapping out their crime scene. We reached Devil's Backbone around noon, and I have to admit, even after 70 years of mountain hiking, that view still took my breath away. The ridge was exactly what its name suggested. A narrow spine of rock stretching between two peaks, with nothing but air and a 1,000-foot drop on either side. On a clear day like that Tuesday, you could see for 50 miles in every direction. This is incredible, Maria, Sarah gushed, pulling out her phone to take pictures. Eddie, can you believe this view? Eddie was standing behind me, looking not at the view but at the trail we'd just climbed. Yeah, he said quietly. It's perfect. I should have caught the tone in his voice. I should have remembered what my father taught me about always knowing where everyone in your group is positioned. I should have trusted the little voice in my head that had kept me safe through 7 decades of wilderness adventures. Instead, I was looking out at the vista, thinking about James, wishing he could have seen this place one more time. That's when Eddie pushed me. It wasn't dramatic or violent, just a firm shove in the small of my back when I was standing close to the edge. 1 second I was admiring the view my husband and I had shared so many times, and the next second I was falling into empty space, my nephew's face disappearing above me as I tumbled toward what should have been my death. But here's the thing about being a mountain guide for 50 years. You learn to fall without panicking. You learn to think even when your body is in free fall, even when death is rushing up to meet you. And most importantly, you learn that these old mountains have been catching people for millions of years, if you know how to let them. The fall that was supposed to kill me became the first step in my survival. And Eddie and Sarah's plan to inherit my property became the catalyst for something they never could have imagined. But this is far from over. Someone with this much mountain wisdom doesn't just disappear, even when family wants them gone. The first thing you need to understand about falling off a cliff is that it's not like the movies. There's no dramatic slow-motion sequence, no time for your life to flash before your eyes. 1 second I was standing on Devil's Backbone Ridge admiring a view I'd seen 100 times before, and the next second I was tumbling through space, bouncing off rock outcroppings and scraping against the mountain face. The human body can survive a surprising amount of trauma when adrenaline kicks in. I hit a ledge about 40 feet down from where Eddie pushed me, a narrow shelf of stone maybe 3 feet wide and 15 feet long. If I'd missed that ledge, if I'd fallen the full 1,000 feet to the bottom of the gorge, this would be a very different story. But I didn't miss it. 78 years of reading these mountains, of understanding how rock breaks and where water flows and how erosion carves paths through stone. All of that knowledge was still working even as I was falling. Some deep part of my brain had seen that ledge, had twisted my body just enough to hit it instead of falling past it. I landed hard, cracked 3 ribs and dislocated my left shoulder, but I was alive. More importantly, I was conscious and thinking clearly enough to understand what had just happened. My own nephew had tried to murder me. I could hear their voices above me. Eddie and Sarah talking in hushed, urgent tones. "Did you see her hit the ledge?" Sarah's voice, tight with anxiety. "I saw her fall. That's enough." Eddie trying to sound confident but with a tremor underneath. "No one survives a fall like that. We need to get out of here." "But what if? What if nothing?" "She's gone, Sarah. It's over." I pressed myself against the rock wall, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. My ribs were on fire, my shoulder was a mess, and I was stranded on a ledge barely wide enough to lie down on. But I was thinking clearly, and what I was thinking was this. They couldn't see me from where they were standing. As far as Eddie and Sarah knew, I had fallen to my death, which meant I had an advantage they didn't expect, the element of surprise. But first I had to survive. I'd been in survival situations before, though never quite like this one. In 50 years of guiding, I'd dealt with everything from sudden storms to broken bones to clients who panicked in dangerous terrain. The key was always the same. Stay calm, assess your resources, make a plan. My resources were limited. I had the clothes I was wearing, hiking boots, jeans, a flannel shirt, and a light jacket. In my pockets, a small folding knife, a compass, some trail mix, and a water bottle that was now cracked and mostly empty. Eddie had been carrying our main supplies in his pack, which I now realized was part of the plan. Leave the old woman with nothing, let exposure and dehydration finish what the fall started. But they'd underestimated what 50 years of mountain experience could do with nothing. The ledge I'd landed on was part of a water seep, a place where groundwater found its way through cracks in the rock and created a tiny ecosystem of moss and hardy plants. That meant water, if I could figure out how to collect it. It also meant some edible vegetation, if I was careful about what I harvested. The first night was the hardest. My ribs made every breath agony, and my dislocated shoulder sent waves of pain through my entire body. The temperature dropped into the 40s, and I had no blanket, no sleeping bag, no way to make a fire on that narrow ledge. But I had something more valuable than gear. I had knowledge. My mother had taught me which plants could help with pain. Growing wild in the cracks of my ledge were several I recognized. Wild mint that could help with nausea, plantain leaves that could reduce swelling. I chewed them slowly, letting their natural compounds work while I planned my next moves. The water seep was producing maybe a cup of water every few hours. I used my cracked water bottle to catch what I could, and I tore strips from my shirt to create a crude solar still, a technique James had taught me years ago for desert survival. By morning, I had enough water to stay functional. Food was trickier. The trail mix would last maybe one more day if I was careful. But growing on the ledge and in cracks I could reach were several plants I knew were safe. Wild onions, dandelion leaves, even some late-season berries from a vine that had found purchase in the rock. Not exactly a feast, but enough to keep my body running while I figured out how to get off that ledge. The second day brought a new challenge: weather. I could read the signs in the wind patterns and cloud formations. A storm was coming, probably that night. Rain on an exposed ledge with no shelter would be deadly, especially with my injured ribs making it hard to stay warm. But storms also brought opportunity, more water to collect, and if I was smart about it, maybe a way to signal for help. I spent the day tearing my extra shirt into strips and weaving them into a crude rope. My dislocated shoulder made the work slow and painful, but I'd reset the joint myself that first morning. Another skill learned from decades of wilderness first aid. The rope wasn't strong enough to support my weight for a full climb, but it might be enough to reach some of the handholds I could see carved by erosion in the rock face above me. As the afternoon wore on, I could hear search and rescue activity in the distance. Helicopters, voices calling my name, the organized chaos of a proper search operation. Eddie and Sarah had reported me missing, claiming I'd gotten separated from them on the trail, and never showed up at our planned meeting spot. The irony was bitter. My nephew was pretending to be devastated by my disappearance, probably crying real tears as he told the searchers how much he loved his Aunt Maria, how worried he was about me being lost in the mountains. But the search teams were looking in the wrong areas. Eddie had told them we'd been hiking near Falls Creek, miles away from Devil's Backbone Ridge. As far as the rescuers knew, there was no reason to search the area where I was actually stranded. That second night, the storm hit. Rain on an exposed mountainside can kill you in a dozen different ways. Hypothermia, flash floods, lightning strikes, or simply washing you off whatever precarious position you're trying to maintain. But I'd weathered mountain storms before, and I knew how to make the best of a bad situation. I positioned myself in the most sheltered corner of the ledge, and used my jacket to funnel rainwater into my bottle and the makeshift containers I'd created from torn fabric. Within an hour, I had more water than I'd had since the fall. I also stripped down to my underwear and let the rain wash the sweat and grime from my body. Staying clean was important for preventing infection in my various cuts and scrapes. But the real benefit of the storm was what it revealed about the rock face around me. Lightning illuminated the cliff wall in stark detail, and I could see what I'd missed in daylight. A series of natural handholds and ledges that formed an irregular path up the rock face. It wasn't a route I would have attempted at 78 with broken ribs and a bad shoulder under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. The third day dawned clear and cold. I knew I had to make my move. My body was weakening despite the wild foods and collected water. The ribs were making it hard to breathe deeply. An infection was starting to set in around some of my cuts. Most importantly, I could hear the search operation winding down. After 3 days without finding any trace of Maria Santos, the official search would be called off soon. Eddie and Sarah would be free to file insurance claims and start the process of inheriting my property. They'd play the role of grieving family members, maybe even hold a memorial service. And I would become just another cautionary tale about old people who overestimated their abilities in the mountains. Like hell. I spent the morning preparing for the climb. I braided my improvised rope more tightly, checked and rechecked every knot. I ate the last of my trail mix and drank as much water as I could hold. Then I reset my shoulder one more time, gritting my teeth against the pain, and started up the rock face. Climbing with broken ribs is like breathing through a straw while someone stabs you in the chest. Every reach for a handhold sent lightning through my torso. My left arm was weak from the shoulder injury, so I had to rely mostly on my right arm and my legs to pull myself up the cliff face. But I'd been climbing these mountains since before Eddie was born. My hands knew how to find the solid holds, how to test each grip before committing my weight to it. My feet remembered how to find the tiny ledges and cracks that could support me. Most importantly, my mind knew how to push through pain and keep focused on the next hold, the next step, the next small victory in what felt like an impossible task. It took me 4 hours to climb 40 feet. When I finally hauled myself over the edge of Devil's Backbone Ridge, I collapsed on solid ground and just lay there for a long time, breathing and bleeding and alive. The sun was starting to set, painting the mountains around me in shades of gold and red that I thought I'd never see again. I was back where my nephew had tried to kill me, but I wasn't the same person who had fallen off this ridge 3 days ago. The mountains had tested me in ways I'd never been tested before, and I had passed. I had survived something that should have killed me, using nothing but the skills and knowledge I'd spent 7 decades accumulating. Eddie and Sarah had no idea what they had awakened, but they were about to find out. Getting off Devil's Backbone Ridge in the dark with broken ribs and no gear would have been suicide for most people. But I wasn't most people anymore. 3 days on that ledge had burned away every bit of softness, every trace of the trusting old woman who had walked up that trail with her nephew and his wife. What came down that mountain was something harder and more focused than Maria Santos had ever been before. I made it to my truck around midnight, driving the back roads with my headlights off until I was well away from the main search areas. I didn't want to be found yet. Not until I was ready. My first stop was Doc Peterson's clinic. At 83, Doc was older than me and had been treating mountain folk for 50 years. He'd sewn up my cuts before, set broken bones for James, and delivered half the babies in 3 counties. Most importantly, he knew how to keep his mouth shut when the situation called for it. "Jesus Christ, Maria," he said when I knocked on his back door at 1 in the morning, looking like I'd been dragged behind a truck for 3 miles. "We've been searching for you for days. Everyone thought I was dead." I finished for him. And for now, I need them to keep thinking that. Doc Peterson had seen enough in his decades of practice to know when not to ask too many questions. He x-rayed my ribs, 3 clean breaks, but they were already starting to heal, cleaned and stitched my cuts, and gave me pain medication and antibiotics. "You want to tell me what really happened up there?" he asked as he wrapped my ribs. "Eddie pushed me off Devil's Backbone Ridge," I said simply. "Him and that wife of his. They thought they were inheriting my property." Doc's hands stilled for a moment. Then he continued wrapping, his jaw tight. "You got proof of that? Not the kind that would hold up in court. But I got something better." "What's that?" "I got time to think, and I got a plan." I spent the next week at Doc's place, recovering and watching. Eddie and Sarah were playing their parts perfectly, the grieving family members devastated by the loss of beloved Tia Maria. The local newspaper ran a nice obituary Sarah had written, full of loving memories and praise for my years of service as a mountain guide. The funeral was well attended. I watched from the woods above the cemetery as dozens of people I'd guided over the years came to pay their respects. Eddie gave a touching eulogy about how much he'd learned from his aunt, how she'd taught him to love the mountains. Sarah stood beside him in a black dress that probably cost more than most people in that cemetery made in a month, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. They were very convincing. I almost believed they were genuinely sad about my death. But I knew better. I'd seen Eddie's face in that split second before he pushed me. I'd heard the relief in their voices when they thought I was dead at the bottom of the gorge. After the funeral, they wasted no time. Within days, Eddie was at the courthouse filing papers to settle my estate. Sarah was meeting with real estate developers about the mineral potential of my property. They'd even started cleaning out my cabin, selling my furniture, and throwing away 50 years' worth of memories. That's when I decided it was time to come back from the dead. I chose a Sunday evening, knowing they'd be at my cabin dividing up my possessions. I parked my truck at the bottom of the mountain and walked up the old logging trail, moving quiet as smoke through woods I'd known since childhood. They had lights on in every room, boxes scattered across my porch, my life reduced to things they could sell and things they could throw away. Through the window, I could see Sarah holding up one of my grandmother's quilts, probably calculating its antique value. I knocked on the door. The silence that followed was profound. Then I heard Eddie's voice uncertain. "Who's there?" "It's your Tia Maria, Mijo. I think we need to have a talk." The sound that came from inside the cabin was something between a gasp and a scream. Glass broke, probably Sarah dropping something. Footsteps ran toward the back of the house, then stopped. I knocked again, patient as the mountains themselves. Eddie opened the door with shaking hands. His face had gone gray, and he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Which, in a way, he had. "Hello, Eddie," I said pleasantly. "Surprised to see me?" Behind him, Sarah appeared in the hallway, her perfect hair disheveled, her designer clothes wrinkled from 3 hours of pawing through my belongings. She was staring at me like I was something that had crawled out of her worst nightmare. "But you fell, we saw you." Eddie's voice cracked like a teenager's. "I did fall," I agreed. "Thanks to you. But these mountains raised me, Eddie. They don't let go of their own that easily." I walked past him into my own cabin, looking around at the chaos they'd made of my home. "Making yourselves comfortable, I see." Sarah found her voice first. "Maria. Oh my God. We thought you were dead. We've been so worried. We organized search parties, You organized search parties in the wrong location," I interrupted. "You told them I got lost near Falls Creek, remember? Not Devil's Backbone Ridge, where you actually left me to die." The pretense crumbled like a house of cards. Eddie's shoulders sagged, and Sarah's face went white. "We can explain," Eddie started. "Oh, I'm sure you can. You're both very good at explaining things. Very convincing." I picked up one of my grandmother's quilts from a box marked, "Donate." "Like how you explained to everyone how much you loved me. How worried you were. How you just wanted to keep me safe." I folded the quilt carefully, the way my mother had taught me. "Tell me, Eddie, what was the plan after I died? Quick probate? Sell the land to those gas companies Sarah's been talking to?" Sarah stepped forward, desperation making her bold. "Maria, you don't understand. We were trying to help you. You're getting old. You could have gotten hurt living up here alone." So you decided to help me by pushing me off a cliff. The words hung in the air like smoke. Eddie finally looked directly at me, and for a moment I saw something that might have been shame in his eyes. How? He asked quietly. How did you survive? I could have told them about the ledge, about the 3 days of survival with nothing but mountain wisdom and stubborn will. I could have described the climb back up the cliff face, the pain and the determination, and the moment when I realized I was stronger than anyone, including myself, had ever imagined. Instead, I just smiled. These mountains don't let go of their own, Eddie. I thought you would have learned that by now. What happened next was up to them. I could call the sheriff, press charges for attempted murder. I could tell the whole story, let everyone in 3 counties know what kind of people Eddie and Sarah really were. But that would mean trials, lawyers, years of fighting. And at 78, I had better things to do with whatever time I had left. Here's what's going to happen, I said, settling into my own chair like I'd never left. You're going to pack up those boxes and take them back where you found them. You're going to return everything you've already taken. And then you're going to get out of my house and off my land. But Maria, Sarah started. I'm not finished. My voice carried the authority of 7 decades in these mountains. You're also going to go to the bank tomorrow and withdraw every penny you've accessed from my accounts while I was dead. You're going to return it with interest. Eddie's face flushed red. We haven't taken anything that wasn't. Wasn't what? Wasn't yours. I laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. Nothing here is yours, Eddie. Nothing here was ever going to be yours. Did you really think I was stupid enough to leave my land to someone who never gave a damn about these mountains? That's when I told them about the will I'd actually written. The one I'd filed with my lawyer 6 months before they tried to kill me. The one that left my entire estate to the Cumberland County Search and Rescue Service, with provisions for a wilderness training center, and a scholarship fund for young people who wanted to learn mountain skills. You see, I explained as they stood there with their mouths hanging open. I knew you didn't really care about me. I've known for years. But I thought maybe you'd at least wait for me to die naturally before you started circling like vultures. The Search and Rescue Service had been like family to me. They were the people who risked their lives to bring lost hikers home safe, who worked for free because they believed in helping others, who understood that these mountains were sacred and needed to be protected. They deserved my legacy far more than 2 people who saw dollar signs when they looked at ancient peaks. Eddie and Sarah left that night with nothing but the shame they'd earned and the knowledge that their greed had cost them everything they'd schemed for. I never saw them again. Last I heard, they'd moved away from the county, probably couldn't stand the looks they got from people who'd figured out the truth. But their betrayal had given me something I didn't expect. Clarity about what the rest of my life should be. Those 3 days on the ledge had shown me I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. More importantly, they'd shown me that all the knowledge I'd accumulated over 7 decades, the survival skills, the mountain wisdom, the ability to read weather and terrain and human nature, needed to be passed on to the next generation. Eddie and Sarah had tried to kill me for money, but they'd accidentally given me something far more valuable, a purpose. 3 years have passed since Eddie pushed me off Devil's Backbone Ridge, and I'm sitting here on my porch at sunset, watching a group of teenagers make their way up the trail to my cabin. They're moving with the confident, careful gait of people who've been properly trained in mountain skills. No stumbling, no wasted energy, reading the terrain like the book it is. These are my kids. Not blood family, but something better. Young people from all over the county who come to learn wilderness skills, mountain safety, and what it really means to respect these ancient peaks. The Maria Santos Wilderness Training Center officially opened 2 years ago, built with insurance money from my death, and funded by donations from people I'd guided over the decades. It's not much to look at. A simple building with classrooms, a gear room, and bunks for overnight stays, but it's already saved lives. Last spring, when 2 college students got lost in a late-season snowstorm, it was one of my trainees, 16-year-old Jessica Martinez, who found them and guided them to safety using navigation skills she'd learned right here on Whispering Ridge. She knew how to read the mountain's moods, how to find shelter, how to stay calm in a crisis. Her parents brought her to me after that rescue, tears in their eyes, thanking me for teaching their daughter skills that most adults don't possess. But Jessica had earned that knowledge the same way I had, through patience, practice, and deep respect for the power of these mountains. Miss Maria, she told me that day, I want to be a guide like you someday. I want to help people understand what these mountains can teach us. That's when I knew Eddie's betrayal had led me exactly where I was supposed to be. The training center runs year-round now. Weekends are for local kids learning basic wilderness skills. Summers bring groups from scout troops, youth programs, even some adults who realize they need to learn proper mountain safety. We teach navigation, weather reading, emergency first aid, wilderness survival, and most importantly, respect for the natural world. But the real education happens during our overnight expeditions. That's when city kids realize they're stronger than they thought. When shy teenagers discover leadership abilities they never knew they had. When young people who've never been away from smartphones and fast food learn they can thrive with nothing but their wits and the skills we've taught them. I still take a few private clients, people who specifically request the legendary Maria Santos for their mountain adventure. Word has gotten around about the miracle of my survival, though most people don't know the full story. They just know that somehow, inexplicably, I came back from what should have been certain death. The truth is, I didn't come back the same person who fell off that ridge. 3 days of survival with nothing but mountain knowledge and stubborn will had burned away everything soft and uncertain about who I was. I came back knowing exactly what my life was for. Doc Peterson stops by most Sunday evenings, still keeping an eye on my health and still keeping my secrets. He's the only one who knows the complete truth about what Eddie and Sarah did. And he's the one who helped me understand something important about forgiveness. You know, Maria, he said to me a few months after I came back from the dead. Holding on to anger is like holding on to hot coals. It burns you more than anyone else. I thought about that for a long time. Eddie and Sarah had tried to kill me for money, had betrayed family bonds that I'd thought were sacred. Did I owe them forgiveness? The answer came to me gradually, the way most mountain wisdom does. I didn't need to forgive them for their sake. I needed to forgive them for mine. Not because what they did was okay, but because carrying that anger was taking energy away from the work I was meant to do. So I let it go. Not the memory. That stays sharp as a warning, but the rage and the hurt and the need for revenge. I gave it to the mountains, the same way I'd given them my grief over James's death, my fear during those 3 days on the ledge, my uncertainty about what came next. The mountains took it all and gave me back something better, peace and purpose. These days, I start every morning the same way I have for 70 years, with coffee on the porch, watching the sun come up over peaks that knew my grandfather's grandfather. But now there's usually a small group of young people joining me, eager to learn what the day's lessons will bring. Yesterday, it was a group of foster kids from the valley, teenagers who'd been bounced between homes and schools, and were suspicious of any adult who claimed to want to help them. By evening, after a day of learning to read animal tracks and finding their way by natural navigation, they were different kids, confident, focused, proud of skills they'd never imagined they could master. Miss Maria, one of them said as we sat around the campfire that night, nobody ever taught us stuff like this before. Like real stuff that actually matters. That's the thing about mountain wisdom. It's not just about surviving in the wilderness. It's about understanding that you're stronger than you think, that knowledge and preparation can get you through almost anything, that the natural world has lessons to teach if you're humble enough to listen. It's about knowing that falling doesn't have to mean failing. Eddie and Sarah thought they were pushing a helpless old woman to her death. Instead, they pushed me toward the most important work of my life. Every young person who learns wilderness skills at my training center, every life saved by someone who learned mountain safety on Whispering Ridge, every teenager who discovers their own strength in these ancient hills, they're all proof that what my nephew meant for evil, the mountains transformed into something beautiful. I'm 81 now, and I know my time as an active guide is coming to an end. My knees remind me of that every morning, and my ribs still ache when storms are coming. But the legacy is secure. Jessica Martinez is already talking about studying outdoor recreation in college, maybe coming back to run the training center someday. 3 other young people from our program have gotten into college on scholarships, planning careers in forestry, environmental science, search and rescue. The knowledge will continue. The respect for these mountains will be passed on to another generation. The skills that kept me alive for 3 days on a narrow ledge will keep other people safe in situations I can't even imagine yet. That's what family really means. Not blood relations who see you as an obstacle to inheritance, but the people who share your values and carry on your work. My real family is scattered across 3 counties now. Former clients who still send Christmas cards, search and rescue volunteers who risk their lives for strangers, young people who learned on my trails that they were braver than they ever dreamed. Last week, I updated my will again. The training center gets the land and the cabin, with enough funding to keep operating for the next 50 years. There are scholarships for kids who can't afford outdoor programs, equipment funds for search and rescue teams, and a small stipend for whoever takes over as head instructor. Eddie and Sarah still aren't mentioned anywhere in the document. I'm not bitter about that anymore. Bitterness is a luxury I can't afford when there's still so much work to do. Every weekend brings new kids to train, new skills to pass on, new opportunities to share what 75 years in these mountains have taught me. And sometimes, on quiet evenings like this one, I sit on my porch and think about that moment when Eddie pushed me off Devil's Backbone Ridge. He thought he was ending my story, closing the book on Maria Santos, so he could claim his inheritance. Instead, he gave me the most important chapter of my life. The mountains that raised me caught me when I fell. They provided everything I needed to survive when survival should have been impossible. They taught me lessons about strength and resilience that I never could have learned any other way. And now they're teaching those same lessons to a new generation of young people, who will carry mountain wisdom forward into a future I won't live to see. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, remember this. The thing that's trying to destroy you might actually be preparing you for your greatest work. The betrayal that breaks your heart might be breaking it open for something larger and more beautiful than you ever imagined. Family isn't always about blood. Legacy isn't always about money. And falling doesn't always mean the end of your story. Sometimes it means you're finally ready to fly. I'm Maria Elena Santos, I'm 81 years old, and I'm the mountain guide who wouldn't fall. These peaks are my home. This work is my calling. And every young person who learns to read these ancient hills with respect and wisdom is proof that some stories are too strong to end with a push off a cliff. The mountains don't let go of their own. And neither do I.